And also, I loved all of his gospel songs too. And meeting him was, at that point, a high thrill.
In the quiet coffee shops of Greenwich Village, a young musician with a rough voice and big dreams was learning his craft. Bob Dylan, who would later become one of America's most important songwriters, didn't create his revolutionary sound from nothing. Instead, he was like a musical sponge, soaking up influences from all corners of American music history. Dylan himself once said that he learned everything from other people. "You can't really learn to write songs sitting in a classroom," he explained. "You learn by listening to records and copying what you hear." The artists he chose to copy tell us a lot about how a small-town kid from Minnesota became a cultural icon who changed music forever. Dylan's musical education came from many different sources, spanning different types of music and different generations. Some of these influences shaped his early folk music years, while others pushed him toward electric rock music. But all of them left their mark on the songs that would change popular music forever. The Stanley Brothers, mountain music that touched Dylan's soul. One of Dylan's earliest and most surprising influences came from the Stanley Brothers, a bluegrass duo from Virginia. Carter and Ralph Stanley created music that captured young Dylan's imagination long before he ever thought about picking up an electric guitar. Dylan discovered their music in the late 1950s while he was exploring American folk traditions as a teenager. What drew Dylan to the Stanley Brothers wasn't just their beautiful harmonies. It was their connection to something deeper and more authentic. Their music came straight from the mountains and coal mines of America, telling real stories about real people's lives. While other teenagers were listening to popular radio hits, Dylan was studying the Stanley Brothers' raw emotion and mountain soul. Dylan once said that Carter Stanley's voice was Lies, key hearing an ancient bell that had been ringing in the mountains for 1,000 years. The Stanley Brothers weren't just performing music, Dylan noted. They were living it. This kind of authenticity became very important to Dylan's own approach to writing songs. You can hear the Stanley Brothers' influence in Dylan's early work, especially in songs from his first album. Their high, lonesome sound taught Dylan that music could be both very old and very immediate at the same time. It could be traditional but still feel revolutionary. The Stanley Brothers showed Dylan that the best American music often came from the edges of society, not from the mainstream. Carter Stanley's haunting singing style and Ralph's driving banjo playing created a template for emotional honesty that Dylan would carry with him throughout his career. For a young songwriter who was still learning his craft, the Stanley Brothers represented everything that music could be: timeless, truthful, and able to transform people's lives. Hank Williams, the master of American songwriting. Hank Williams had an even deeper influence on Dylan's development as a songwriter. Dylan has called Williams the master of the universe, and credits him with teaching the basic principles of American songwriting. This influence runs so deep through Dylan's work that it's impossible to imagine his career without it. Dylan discovered Hank Williams during his teenage years in Minnesota, listening to late-night radio broadcasts from the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. According to Dylan's own memoir, hearing Williams sing "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry" was like getting struck by lightning. Suddenly he understood what songs could really do. What fascinated Dylan wasn't just Williams' voice, but his ability to turn personal pain into universal truth. While other country singers were playing it safe, Williams was putting his heart and soul on vinyl, turning heartbreak into 3-minute masterpieces that cut straight to the bone. Hank Williams was the first person to make Dylan realize that songs could be literature, Dylan said. Williams wasn't just singing, he was confessing his deepest feelings. You can hear Williams' influence throughout Dylan's entire catalog of songs. From the storytelling style in Tangled Up in Blue to the raw emotion of his Blood on the Tracks album, Williams taught Dylan that the best songs come from the darkest places in a person's life. Real authenticity requires being vulnerable and honest about your feelings. Williams showed Dylan that country music wasn't just about fiddles and steel guitars. It was about telling the truth. Hank's troubled genius proved that real songwriters don't just entertain people. Ayan bayamandito. They dig deep into the human condition and serve it up with a melody that stays with you forever. The Everly Brothers, perfect harmonies and modern innovation. The Everly Brothers, Don and Phil, were harmony singers from Kentucky who bridged the gap between country music and rock and roll in ways that amazed Dylan. They weren't just singers. They were architects of a sound that would influence everyone from the Beatles to Simon and Garfunkel. Dylan discovered the Everly Brothers in the late 1950s when their hit Bye Bye Love was dominating radio stations across America. Music journalists reported that Dylan was mesmerized by their seamless blend of country storytelling and rock and roll energy. What fascinated Dylan about the Everlys was their brotherly chemistry. They had two voices that became one without losing their individual character. Their harmonies were so tight that I seemed telepathic, creating a sound that was both intimate and expansive. Dylan once said that the Everly Brothers had a brotherly sound that nobody else could touch. When they sang together, it was like hearing one person with two souls. You can trace the Everly Brothers' influence through Dylan's electric period, especially in songs like I Want You and Just Like a Woman. Their ability to make complex emotions sound effortless taught Dylan that sophistication doesn't require being pretentious. The Everlys also showed Dylan how to modernize traditional sounds without losing their essence. They took Appalachian harmonies and dressed them up for the rock and roll generation, creating a blueprint that Dylan would follow throughout his career. For Dylan, the Everly Brothers proved that innovation comes from synthesis, taking the old and making it new, honoring tradition while pushing boundaries forward. Buddy Holly, the independent artist who showed the way. Buddy Holly, the bespectacled genius from Texas, showed Dylan that rock and roll could be both rebellious and intellectual. Holly wasn't just a performer. He was a songwriter, producer, and innovator who did everything himself. Dylan discovered Buddy Holly in 1959, just months before Holly's tragic death in a plane crash. According to Dylan's autobiography, seeing Holly perform live was a life-changing moment that shifted his entire musical perspective. What captivated Dylan about Holly was his independence. Here was a guy who wrote his own songs, played his own instruments, and controlled his own sound. While other rock stars relied on teams of writers and producers, Holly was a one-man creative force. Buddy Holly was the first one to show Dylan the way, Dylan said. He made it look possible for someone like Dylan to actually have a career in music. Holly's influence appears throughout Dylan's career, from his early rock experiments to his later Americana albums. Songs like Subterranean Homesick Blues echo Holly's rhythmic wordplay, while Dylan's do-it-yourself recording approach mirrors Holly's studio innovations. Most importantly, Holly taught Dylan that rock and roll didn't have to be dumb. His songs were clever without being pretentious, catchy without being shallow, a combination that became Dylan's signature style. Buddy Holly proved to Dylan that authenticity and intelligence could coexist in popular music, paving the way for everything that followed in his revolutionary career. The band, musical brotherhood, and creative partnership. The band became Dylan's most important creative partnership. This group of Canadian and American musicians started as Dylan's backing band, but evolved into a musical brotherhood that changed the course of rock history. Dylan first met them in 1965, when they were still called the Hawks, backing rockabilly legend Ronnie Hawkins. Dylan was looking for musicians who could match his intensity during his controversial transition from acoustic folk music to electric rock. What made the band special wasn't just their musical skills, it was their chemistry. These weren't hired musicians just playing Dylan's songs. They were true collaborators who understood his vision and pushed it further. Their rootsy American sound gave Dylan's electric experiments a timeless quality. Dylan said they were the best band he ever worked with. They could play anything and make it sound like it belonged in some backwoods barn. The partnership reached its peak Eek during the legendary Basement Tapes sessions in 1967. Holed up in a house in Woodstock, New York, Dylan and the band created a new kind of American music that was relaxed, playful, and deeply rooted in folk traditions. The band taught Dylan that collaboration could enhance rather than compromise his artistic vision. Their influence appears on masterpieces like Blood on the Tracks and Desire, where Dylan's storytelling merged with their intuitive musicianship. Together, they proved that rock music could be both revolutionary and traditional, creating a template that countless artists still follow today. The Beatles, the ultimate creative challenge. At the top of the list of Dylan's influences are the Beatles. The Fab Four from Liverpool pushed Dylan into his most revolutionary period and sparked a musical competition that changed everything. John, Paul, George, and Ringo weren't just Dylan's contemporaries. They were his greatest creative challenge and inspiration. Dylan first heard the Beatles in 1964 when I Want to Hold Your Hand exploded across America. According to journalists who knew him at the time, Dylan was initially dismissive, calling their music bubblegum. But something about their energy and innovation kept drawing him back. What changed Dylan's mind was realizing that the Beatles were evolving at lightning speed. Each album showed new sophistication, new experiments, and new boundaries being broken. They were doing what Dylan thought only he could do, constantly reinventing themselves. Dylan said they were doing things nobody was doing. They weren't just following the rules, they were writing new ones every time they stepped into the recording studio. The mutual influence between Dylan and the Beatles became legendary. Dylan introduced the Beatles to deeper lyrical possibilities, while they showed him the power of studio experimentation and electric arrangements. Their famous meetings in 1964 and 1965 created a creative feedback loop that revolutionized popular music. The Beatles taught Dylan that being popular didn't mean selling out. It meant reaching more people with your vision and changing the world one song at a time. These 6 influences, the Stanley Brothers, Hank Williams, the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly, the band, and the Beatles, combined to create the unique voice that became Bob Dylan. Each one contributed something different: authenticity, storytelling, harmony, independence, collaboration, and innovation. Together, they helped shape one of the most important artists in American music history.